You know, sometimes the smallest moment in life, the kind that seems so ordinary, so insignificant that no one else in the room even notices, can completely flip the script of history. Imagine walking into a bank, just like any other person, holding your ID and a simple request, and instead of being treated with dignity, the teller smirks, scoffs, and lets out a laugh as though your presence is nothing but a joke. That's exactly what happened to a woman most of the world had never even heard of before this day. A black woman who carried with her not just an ID card, but a name and a signature tied to one of the biggest financial moves in recent memory. She stepped up to the counter, confident in her stride. But the second she slid her ID across the glass, the teller tilted her head, raised her brows, and chuckled. It wasn't the kind of chuckle you share with a friend when something's funny. It was the kind of laugh that says, "You can't possibly be who you claim to be." The woman paused, staring at the teller, and the silence between them grew. Heavy, charged, almost electric. What the teller didn't know, what no one in that lobby knew, was that this very signature, the one she was about to mock, had the power to freeze a deal worth $3 billion. Yes, $3 billion, the kind of number that doesn't just make headlines, but shakes boardrooms, impacts stock markets, and leaves CEOs pacing late into the night. But before any of that unfolded, it began with this moment, in this bank, under the fluorescent lights, where prejudice, arrogance, and ignorance collided with resilience, truth, and a quiet kind of power that didn't need to announce itself. This is not just a story about money. It's about dignity, identity, and how one person's laughter turned into the undoing of an empire. It's about how a woman who was underestimated her whole life finally showed the world that her name wasn't just ink on paper, it was the key to a fortune, a weapon against arrogance, and a lesson carved into the memory of everyone who dared to dismiss her. And you watching this right now might think you've heard stories of disrespect before, of people being looked down on because of their skin, their gender, their background. But trust me, you've never heard one quite like this, because the chain of events that followed her signature didn't just affect her. It sent shockwaves across the globe, and it all began with a laugh. The laugh lingered longer than it should have, echoing inside her mind as though the teller had announced it over the intercom for the whole bank to hear. She had grown used to moments like these, tiny humiliations packaged inside polite institutions where power hid behind a desk, a computer, and a name tag. But something about this day was different. Maybe it was the way the other customers glanced sideways, pretending not to notice but secretly feeding on the awkwardness. Or maybe it was the way the teller leaned back in her chair, folding her arms with a smirk as if daring her to prove she belonged there. The woman's hand didn't tremble as she picked up her ID again, her fingers tracing the edges of the card as though it were more than laminated plastic. It was a declaration of who she was and everything she had survived. She slid it back, across the glass, meeting the teller's eyes with a gaze so steady it silenced the smirk for just a second. "Run it again," she said calmly, her voice carrying a weight that demanded attention. The teller rolled her eyes but typed into the computer, still muttering something under her breath that carried the faint trace of mockery. What she didn't know was that the name glowing on her screen was tied not just to an account, but to a contract that held $3 billion in suspension, a deal involving corporations so massive their logos lit up skyscrapers across continents. And in that moment, with a few keystrokes and one signature, the balance of power shifted. The teller's laughter, so small and cruel, had accidentally opened the door to a reckoning. Because while she was mocking a woman she thought insignificant, executives in glass towers thousands of miles away were pacing, watching phones that wouldn't ring, waiting for an approval that never came. The black woman, who had walked into this bank carrying only her ID and her pride, was about to show the world that she wasn't just another customer. She was the hinge upon which billions rested. And as the teller kept smirking, oblivious to the storm brewing behind those glowing screens, the woman's pen touched the paper, and with a single stroke of ink, she froze. Time. froze arrogance, and froze a deal so massive that newsrooms and markets would soon erupt. What began as laughter in a bank lobby was turning into silence across boardrooms, and no one, not the teller, not the executives, not even the woman herself, could have predicted just how far this signature would reach, or how deeply it would cut. Outside that bank, the world went on as usual. Traffic lights changed, horns blared, and people hustled from one appointment to the next. But inside, something extraordinary was taking shape, though only one person in that room truly felt the gravity of it. The woman's signature wasn't just ink. It was the culmination of decades of battles fought quietly, moments where she had been told no 100 times before she finally earned a yes, nights spent awake studying contracts, running numbers, and memorizing fine print because she knew people would doubt her capability at every turn. Every flourish of her pen was rooted in resilience, in the long history of her family who had clawed their way through hardship, in the whispered prayers of a grandmother who had once picked cotton under the blistering sun and told her granddaughter never to bow her head to anyone. The teller, impatient now, drummed her nails against the desk, utterly unaware that the paper sliding back toward her wasn't just paperwork. It was a roadblock that would stop a $3 billion train in its tracks. In sleek towers in Taipei, New York, in offices humming with fluorescent lights in London, in boardrooms in Tokyo where men in tailored suits spoke in hushed voices, contracts sat unsigned, deals sat pending, and screens flashed with alerts no one could yet explain. Phones rang without answers, assistants typed out frantic emails, and still the missing piece was her signature. And here she was, in a simple blouse, her ID still lying under the teller's judgmental gaze, with a kind of unbothered calm that came from knowing who she was even when the world laughed at her. The irony dripped heavy. The teller's laugh had been meant to belittle her, but in truth, it had lit a fuse that was about to set entire financial empires on fire. Because the signature didn't just freeze numbers, it exposed arrogance, pulled back the curtain on biases so deep that billionaires had trusted the wrong people and underestimated the right one. The black woman took her receipt, tucked her ID back into her wallet, and walked out without a word, her heels clicking against the tile floor, each step an unspoken reminder that sometimes the quietest exits leave the loudest echoes. By the time she left the bank and stepped into the warm air outside, the world had already begun to shift in ways invisible to the ordinary passerby. A man in a suit brushed past her without a glance. A mother pulled her child's hand across the crosswalk. A street vendor shouted about fresh fruit under a striped umbrella, but hundreds of miles away, entire conversations were halting mid-sentence. In a glass tower downtown, an executive slammed his palm against a polished mahogany table because the confirmation he expected still hadn't arrived. He had been confident, too confident, bragging to colleagues that the deal was as good as sealed, but now there was a hollow ring in his chest every time he refreshed his inbox. Another team of lawyers sat in silence, folders of meticulously drafted paperwork spread out before them, wondering why the green light never came. The black woman's name was on every page of that deal, her approval required before billions could be wired, before stock prices could be adjusted, before headlines could be drafted. And yet she had chosen, with that steady hand and that unshakable stare in the bank lobby, to stall the entire machine. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene, didn't even correct the teller's mocking laugh. Instead, she let the weight of her silence do the work, and that silence traveled farther than she could see, through cables, through screens, through corporate systems built on the arrogance of men who had thought they could laugh at her too. For the first time in years, those executives felt powerless, their empire of glass trembling because one woman refused to be dismissed. She walked down the street now with her head held high, unaware of the ripple she was creating in skyscrapers, where board members whispered in panic. And while the teller was likely moving on to the next customer, still smug and ignorant of what she had triggered, history was already rearranging itself behind the curtain. Deals of this size are like living creatures. billion-dollar beasts, fed by greed, pride, and calculation. And when one person seizes control of the leash, the entire beast thrashes. That day, with her pen and her patience, she wasn't just signing papers. She was reminding the world that dignity has power, that identity cannot be laughed away, and that the underestimated often carry the sharpest edge. As the hours passed, the silence surrounding the deal grew louder than any words could. News trickled through trading floors like a rumor no one wanted to believe. Analysts whispered about delays. Interns carried stacks of reports from one desk to another, and every time the phone rang in the offices of those billion-dollar corporations, the sound made hearts leap only to fall again when the voice on the other end had no answers. Investors who had been promised certainty began calling with sharp voices, their patience thinning as numbers on the screen stalled. But the one person who could unlock it all, the black woman whose ID had been laughed at earlier that day, went on about her evening in peace. She cooked dinner slowly, savoring each step, almost as if reclaiming time for herself from a world that had so often stolen it. She spoke softly on the phone with a friend, not mentioning what had happened in the bank lobby, because to her, such disrespect had long since become routine. But beneath her calm exterior was a quiet fire, a sense that perhaps this time the world would finally see the weight of its own arrogance. The teller's laugh, which had been nothing but a casual cruelty in the moment, was now the echo ringing through conference calls across continents, where high-ranking voices asked the same question over and over: why hasn't she signed? The irony was unbearable. Men who had mocked her capabilities in boardrooms, who had reduced her presence to a footnote in contracts, were now pausing entire operations, waiting on her to move her pen again. And she, the woman who had been underestimated, ignored and belittled, finally felt the shift, the realization that her silence was more powerful than their noise. Every deal has a weak point, a moment where leverage tilts, and that moment had arrived. What they thought was routine paperwork had transformed into a barricade, and what the teller thought was a joke had become the crack that split an empire's foundation. The city outside glittered as night settled in, and while the towers still stood tall against the dark, inside their walls there was panic, fear, and the unshakable awareness that one woman's dignity had managed to hold $3 billion hostage. By the following morning, the story had begun to leak beyond the closed circles of executives and bankers. A journalist, tipped off by whispers from an assistant who had overheard fragments of a late-night call, began piecing together a narrative that seemed almost unbelievable. That a single missing signature had stalled a $3 billion agreement, and that the person holding the pen was not one of the expected names in glossy magazines, but a black woman no one in the financial press had written about before. The whispers became chatter, and the chatter soon became headlines drafted in, urgency but withheld for confirmation. Meanwhile, inside her modest home, she poured herself coffee, sat by the window, and read the morning paper as though the weight of global markets wasn't resting on her shoulders. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly what she had done. But she also understood that power is rarely taken seriously when it comes in the hands of someone society tries to overlook. The teller at the bank likely returned to her shift, laughing, again at other customers, still blind to the fact that she had been the match that struck this blaze. But across oceans, men in expensive suits were calling emergency meetings, their voices rising in frustration, their eyes darting across spreadsheets that couldn't explain what pride had refused to see. This woman, the one who had walked into a bank and been mocked for daring to claim her own identity, now held their billion-dollar empire on pause with nothing more than her silence and her pen. Lawyers drafted frantic addendums, assistants scribbled notes, and entire chains of command froze in confusion. And yet, through all of it, she moved deliberately, choosing not to rush, refusing to bend to the pressure that had crushed so many before her. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about every smirk, every dismissal, every time someone had laughed at her existence. Her pause wasn't negligence, it was defiance. And as the sun climbed higher that morning, while screens blinked red with warnings and executives snapped at each other in frustration, one truth became impossible to deny. The underestimated woman had turned the tables, and the world would have no choice but to recognize her now. By the end of that week, the silence she held had transformed into a roar heard across the globe. Networks finally broke the story. $3 billion deal frozen over signature, the headlines blared. But what captured people wasn't just the number, it was the face of the woman behind it. Images of her walking calmly into that bank, carrying nothing more than her ID and her dignity, began circulating, her name suddenly spoken with awe by the same people who once doubted it. The teller who had laughed at her now watched the news with wide eyes, realizing too late that the woman she mocked had become the most powerful figure in the business world for those few defining days. In living rooms and offices everywhere, conversations shifted from laughter and mockery to respect and even fear. And yet for her, it wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, about showing the world that every time it tried to silence her, she would find a louder way to speak. That signature, the one dismissed as laughable, had become the symbol of resistance against arrogance, proof that power doesn't always wear a tailored suit or sit at the head of a boardroom table. Sometimes it lives quietly in the hands of those who are underestimated, waiting for the right moment to remind the world of their worth. The $3 billion deal eventually crumbled under the weight of its own delay. Stock prices fell, and companies scrambled to pick up the pieces. But her life changed forever. Not because she suddenly sought fame or fortune, she had already earned her place, but because she had rewritten the narrative forced on her by years of dismissal. In the end, her story wasn't just about a bank teller's laugh, or even about money. It was about dignity reclaimed, identity defended, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the most powerful message you can deliver is not with anger or noise, but with silence, patience, and a single stroke of a pen. And for everyone watching, for everyone who had ever been laughed at, mocked, or underestimated, her story became more than news. It became a reminder that the world may laugh at you today, but tomorrow it might be forced to reckon with the power of your name.